Well, hey all, it is Mr. Gallion, and this is Standard 1.5. We're going to start talking about the Constitutional Convention. I mentioned to a couple of you in class that it didn't seem like Friday was a good day to be doing the Constitution because there's so much to cover. So actually, I'm going to divide this into 2 days. It's always divided into 2 days, but I'm going to flip-flop the days. So this will actually be the shorter one, and then Monday, the other stuff we'll do, which is better suited for group work, we'll do then. So I'm going to dive in. This will go quick. Some of these slides I might go really quickly through because a lot of this, frankly, is repeated from government. Okay, so if you've taken that, a lot of this should be very familiar. Let's see what we got. Let me just give you a little bit of an overview of where we come from. We did the Articles of Confederation last time we were together. And we said that 12 of the 13 states get together in Philadelphia to try to fix up the Articles. And they end up wiping it out and saying, let's just write a brand new document. And they end up writing the Constitution. Well, what we're going to talk about today are some of the big ideas that everybody agreed to. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the debates next time and maybe even dig into the Constitution a little bit. So we're going to talk about those big ideas that pretty much everybody agreed on the front end. Okay. So by the time we walk out of here, you should be able to identify and explain some of the major principles of the Constitution. And you will notice that a bunch of these ideas are actually above my board in my room. So we'll talk about them from time to time, and I might point your attention there. And we've already talked about the social contract. That's John Locke. It's the idea that the government has the right to rule because the people allow it to. They're supposed to be working for us. Sometimes we forget that, but we, the people, are the ones who rule the government, not the other way around. Although they do, we run the government. If we don't like what they're doing, we can vote them out of office. We're not just their subjects. They're made up of us. We talked about this a little bit in class today, actually. Who should have more power, the federal government or the state government? Well, after things with the Articles of Confederation didn't go so well, we decided maybe it's better to give the central government the final say if there's ever a debate. This is directly because of the Articles of Confederation not working out. But if there's ever a disagreement between the state and the federal government is going to win just about every time. There are some asterisk type exceptions there, but usually the central government's going to win. We believe in a limited government, that the government has to stop at certain points. It can't go beyond what it's specifically allowed to do in the Constitution. Again, there are some sort of exceptions to this, and I'll tell you what one is right now. We'll talk about this a little more later, but there's something called the Elastic Clause. Specifically, it says government can do whatever is necessary and proper. And what that means is unclear, right? It's kind of broad. We can do all kinds of stuff. That's how we end up with the government over healthcare and the government over there's a national bank in American history, but there are supposed to be some very clear limits that they can't go beyond, some things they can't do. And eventually the Bill of Rights is going to say you can't take away the right to freedom of speech or freedom of the press or freedom of religion or the right to bear arms. We believe everybody agreed in the separation of powers. This is one of those things that you talked about in government class. I'm not going to belabor this, but if you have an absolute monarch, he can make laws, he can carry out the laws, and he can punish you for breaking the laws. And these guys in the Constitutional Convention are like, no, that's too much power for one person. We've got to break that up. And so he divided into the Congress, the presidents, and the courts, also known as the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But we also want to make sure that those branches that we create don't go beyond their powers. And so we intentionally create the government so that each branch is constantly checking up on the others. What if the legislative branch makes a bad law? What if they pass a law that says we're going to execute anybody who jaywalks? Well, that law gets to the president, and the president is like, no, we're gonna get rid of that thing. We're gonna veto it, which we'll throw in there later. What if the president okays it? Well, then it goes to the Supreme Court if somebody sues and says, don't execute me for jaywalking, and the court gets a chance to look at it. What happens if the president starts breaking the law? Well, we can impeach him. How do we make sure that the people who get on the Supreme Court aren't bad people? Well, the president appoints them, and then the legislative branch has a say. They have to approve him. So each branch is constantly making sure that the other guys stay in their lane and calls them back. So we're checking up on them and then we're balancing them if it's out of balance. There's a list of all the different ways that those guys balance each other. I'm actually not going to focus on that right now. Federalism. Federalism I'm going to park on for just a minute because a lot of people get confused, okay? Federalism is this idea that, yeah, we have a federal government, but it's not the same as this principle of sovereignty that we talked about before. Sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty says if the state and the federal government ever disagree, the federal government wins. But there are sometimes the federal government just doesn't care what the states are doing. I'll give you an example. Think about marriage. You ever notice that some states you can get married when you're, I think, 17, some you can get married when you're 18, some you have to have parental consent until you're at a certain age. Sometimes you can, I'm not making this up, marry your first cousin. Sometimes you can't marry your first cousin. That's because of the idea of federalism. Yes, the federal government has a certain group of powers that it has, and so do the states. And there's sometimes where those things overlap, but they don't completely overlap. This diagram there is not a complete circle, okay? So in theory, the schools are supposed to be run by the states, not the federal government, although the federal government does a good job of goofing that one up, okay? Things like how do you get a license? In order to get a driver's license in South Carolina, you have to do a different set of things than you do in Ohio, where I got mine. In Ohio, we had to do a driving test, like a road test, which you do in South Carolina, and then something called maneuverability, where you had cones you had to maneuver through, and then you had to back up through them. In South Carolina, you don't do the cones, you do parallel parking. So the idea is, yes, we've divided power, and in some cases we share it. Both the federal and the state governments can set up courts or taxes. Both have a responsibility to maintain law and order. That's why you have the FBI at the federal level and the state police at the local level and the regular police. So federalism is the idea that we're going to share these powers. In some cases, they overlap, and because of the principle of sovereignty, if there's ever a conflict, the central government wins. By the way, I didn't mention things the federal government can do alone. The federal government can declare war. The federal government can set up money. You don't really want every state having its own currency. You don't want South Carolina declaring war on Brazil. Okay, that's a mess. So, federalism. We also believe and weave into the Constitution this idea of individual rights, the idea that we're supposed to protect people from the abuse of governmental power. Just because we can do something with a majority doesn't mean we should. And so we have things like you can petition the government. Okay? You have freedom of speech. If you don't agree with what the government does, you can tell them to do something else. Okay? And then there are some specific concerns that are going to arise. For example, what do we do if the president's accused of doing some like bad stuff, like breaking the law? They say, yeah, that's a problem. They didn't have that issue under the Articles of Confederation because they had no president, no executive. They say, well, why don't we give Congress the power to impeach the president if he's accused of stuff? Now, some of you think that means we kick him out of office, and it can result in that, but what they're going to do is basically just decide, is this guy or woman guilty or innocent of the things they're accused of? And if he is guilty, well, then we decide what to do, and we're probably going to kick him out. And if he's not guilty, then he can stay. To this date, we've only had 3 presidents impeached. We had Andrew Johnson, we had Bill Clinton, and most recently, President Trump. This year, actually, believe it or not, feels like a long time ago. None of them were kicked out of office because they were all basically acquitted of the charges. Okay? And then the Constitutional Convention folks say, well, you know, if we give Congress the power to pass laws, they might pass some really bad laws. They say, yeah, so let's give the president the power to veto laws. It's a specific check that they put into place. They can veto the laws. And then beyond that, the courts actually have the power to say that law is unconstitutional. It's actually not in the Constitution where they get that power. We'll talk about that in a few days. But that's a big deal, okay? It's one of those things they do to make sure that there are not too many, excuse me, that there are not too many laws that get through that are bad laws. There's a concern about how do we make sure that we get representation at the individual level, like the population level, but also that the states are represented. And the way they solve that is that they say that Senators are supposed to represent the states. It's one of the reasons that every state has two, because the states are supposed to be represented by them. Now, that's going to change later on down the road, where people directly elect senators. But it used to be that if the governor liked you, he could appoint you, or she could appoint you as the representative or the senator from your state. Or they could be decided by your state Congress, right? Kind of funky. And because of that, though, there's a real concern. If the states are represented in the Senate, the representatives are supposed to represent the people, okay? So the reason I point that out is that we have this big idea we've mentioned before that there's not supposed to be any taxation without representation. Well, because the representatives are supposed to be most directly responding to the people, we put in the Constitution that taxes can only originate in the House of Representatives. Your senators can't introduce a new taxation bill that goes against the Constitution, which is just kind of a nice little trail back to our basic principles. We also throw this thing into the Constitution that is, some people would say it's old school, some people say it's wise, and we can discuss that one all day if we want to. You realize that when we vote in any November, that we vote for the president, we're not actually voting for the president, but we're voting for the electors who will represent the president, because the Electoral College elects the president, not the people. That's kind of a funky deal, but basically every state decides how they're going to choose their electors. And right now, the vast majority of them say if any more than half of the people in our state vote for one party, all the electors from our state go to that party. So in South Carolina in 2008, you can see there are 8 electors there. That's what that 8 represents. If any more than half of the, apparently in 2008, more than half the people in South Carolina voted Republican. Therefore, all 8 of our electors were Republican electors. That means is all the Democrat votes got thrown out. In California, there were 55 electoral votes up for grabs. That's based on their population. There are more people living in California than in South Carolina. And all the Republican votes got thrown out because the Democrats got more than half of the vote. That's super controversial because when you're throwing out a bunch of votes, what that means is maybe the person who gets more votes doesn't actually win the presidency. Down in 2016, you can see there, 64 million people voted for Hillary Clinton and 62 million people voted for Donald Trump. But because of the way we handle this electoral college, even though 2 million more people voted for Clinton, she is not the president as of this recording. It's an interesting thing you understand. There's also a concern about the Supreme Court because everybody agrees that Supreme Court justices shouldn't have to worry about being elected every couple years, because if you're on there, you should be free of those concerns. We don't want to have, you have to worry about, well, am I going to vote this way or that way on the court because maybe if I vote this way, I won't get reelected. We just want you to do what's best as you interpret the Constitution. So the Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president, but the framers of the Constitution feel like we need another voice. And so we say, before those folks go directly to the Supreme Court, let's have the Senate vote on it, okay? Very, very important, because those guys are there for life. And so we want both sides to weigh in. So the president's not just appointing his buddies who may not know anything about the law. Last little thing that I'll mention is a question that comes up a lot, and that is, are we a democracy or a republic? And the answer is we're kind of both. There are times when we vote on things like specific taxes come through from time to time. And we vote for people as well who then represent us. That's the way we choose the folks who go to Congress to represent us. Therefore, we are a democratic republic. We have elements of both. Now, that's the end of the notes. And I know those are not like gripping notes at all. That's just kind of a list of things which I like to avoid. The good news is, yeah, that's it. You're done. Now, there are 2 different homework assignments. One is for my honors class. One is for my non-honors class. So please look to your specific Google Classroom assignment to see which one you get. If you have questions about the content, shoot me an email. I'll see you guys next time.